My name is Marlene Whitfield, and 18 months ago, I was living in a cramped apartment in Denver, working as a dental hygienist and paying off student loans one careful paycheck at a time. Then, a letter arrived unexpectedly from a law office in a small Texas town called Cedar Hollow, informing me that my great-uncle Roy had passed away and left me his ranch. I had met Roy exactly twice in my life, both times as a child at family reunions where he sat quietly in the corner, sipping sweet tea and telling stories about cattle drives that nobody quite believed anymore. I nearly didn't go at all. I assumed the ranch was a few sagging acres with a leaning barn, worth just enough to cover the taxes owed on it. But something pulled at me. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the simple fact that no one had ever left me anything before. So I packed a bag and drove 14 hours south to see it for myself. The ranch was larger than I expected. Nearly 400 acres of rolling grassland, a modest farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and a windmill that still creaked in the breeze. Exactly the way I remembered from those childhood visits. The house itself was dusty, but structurally sound. Roy, it turned out, had been quietly meticulous about maintenance, even as he let the fields go fallow in his final years. Boxes of old ledgers, hand-drawn maps of the property, and photographs of cattle drives spanning 6 decades filled an entire hall closet. I decided to stay for a week to sort through his belongings before deciding what to do with the place. That week turned into a month. The neighbors, a friendly retired schoolteacher named Dorothy and her husband Hank, brought over warm casseroles and told me stories about Roy that made him feel less like a stranger and more like family. They also mentioned, almost in passing, that the ranch sat within the boundary of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, a detail that hadn't appeared anywhere in the estate paperwork. I didn't think much of it at first. The HOA, as Dorothy explained, mostly concerned itself with keeping fence lines tidy and organizing the annual harvest festival. It didn't seem like the kind of organization that would ever cross paths with a working ranch. I was wrong about how significant that detail would eventually become, though not in the way anyone might expect from a lesser story. No threats, no confrontations, just an interesting negotiation that would end up teaching me more about community and board partnership than I ever anticipated. 3 months into settling the estate, a soil surveyor named Priya Anand knocked on my door. She worked for a small geological consulting firm and had been conducting routine mineral surveys across several nearby ranches in the county, cataloging soil composition for an agricultural research grant. During her work, her equipment picked up unusual readings beneath the northern pasture. The same stretch of land where Roy's old ledgers noted the Salt Flat in his careful, faded handwriting. Within 2 weeks, a proper survey team arrived with Priya's recommendation, and what they found changed everything. A substantial oil reserve sitting beneath roughly 60 acres of the ranch, undisturbed for who knows how many decades because nobody had ever thought to look. The geologist leading the team, a soft-spoken man named Walter Kim, told me it was one of the more promising finds in the region in years, though he was careful to emphasize that extraction would require permits, environmental review, and patience. I sat on the porch that evening trying to process the news. A ranch I hadn't known existed a few months earlier, now potentially held enough value to change my entire life. I thought about calling my sister, my old dental office, anyone who might help me feel less overwhelmed. Instead, I called Dorothy, who by then had become something like a surrogate aunt to me. "Well," she said after I explained everything, "I suppose you'll be having a conversation with the HOA board sooner rather than later." I asked her why that would matter. After all, the mineral rights were mine, the land was mine, and nothing in Roy's original covenant agreement mentioned resource extraction. Dorothy explained that the Cedar Hollow HOA had been established decades earlier with a somewhat unusual provision. Any commercial development on association land, including energy development, required a joint review process with the HOA's Land Use Committee. It wasn't about ownership, she clarified. It was about coordination, making sure that any major changes to the landscape wouldn't affect water tables, road usage, or neighboring properties. I'll admit my first reaction was mild frustration. I had inherited this ranch, done nothing wrong, and now faced a review process I hadn't chosen to be part of. But Dorothy, ever the retired schoolteacher, reminded me gently that community structures, like this one, had kept Cedar Hollow thriving for generations, protecting small ranchers from being steamrolled by larger interests, and ensuring that no single property owner made decisions that could dry up a neighbor's well or clog the single access road with heavy trucks. The HOA board scheduled a meeting for the following week. I arrived nervous, half expecting a hostile room of suspicious neighbors ready to block my good fortune out of envy or bureaucracy. What I found instead was a conference room in the community center decorated with photographs of harvest festivals going back to the 1970s, and a board of 5 people, most of whom I already recognized from around town. The board president, a rancher named Otis Bellwether, opened the meeting by congratulating me on the discovery. "Oil under Roy's land," he said, shaking his head with a smile. "That old man would have gotten a kick out of that. He always said there was something special under that northern pasture, though I don't think even he knew what." The conversation that followed was less a negotiation and more a genuine collaboration. The land use committee's chief concern was the county road that connected the ranch to the highway, a narrow, unpaved route that couldn't handle heavy truck traffic without significant reinforcement. If extraction moved forward without upgrading the road, deliveries and construction, vehicles could damage it for every family who used it to reach town. Rather than blocking my plans, the board proposed a partnership. The HOA would support fast-tracking permits and county approvals if I agreed to fund a portion of the road's reinforcement, ensuring long-term benefit for the whole community, not just my ranch. In exchange, they offered access to the association's legal resources, which had handled zoning matters for the county for over 20 years, and could help me navigate environmental review far more efficiently than I could alone. I remember feeling a wave of relief, so strong I nearly laughed out loud. I had been so prepared for opposition that I hadn't considered the possibility of genuine support. Over the following months, the partnership deepened. Walter Kim's team worked alongside county environmental reviewers to ensure the extraction plan minimized disruption to groundwater and wildlife corridors. The HOA's legal advisor, a soft-spoken but sharp woman named Renata Ochoa, helped me draft an agreement that allocated a percentage of future royalties toward a community fund. Money that would go toward road maintenance, scholarships for local students, and eventually, a renovation of the aging community center where we'd first met. Not everyone in Cedar Hollow was initially thrilled about an oil operation nearby, of course. At a town hall a few weeks later, an elderly rancher named Cyrus Todd stood up and voiced concern about noise and truck traffic affecting his cattle. Rather than dismissing him, I asked if he'd be willing to walk the property with me and Walter's team so we could adjust the access route to keep the operation as far from his grazing land as possible. He agreed, and by the end of that walk, he was pointing out where his grandfather used to graze cattle in the very same fields, sharing stories that reminded me so much of Roy's handwritten ledgers that I nearly cried. That walk turned into something of a weekly tradition. Cyrus, it turned out, had known Roy better than almost anyone else in town, and he began stopping by the ranch on Sunday afternoons to help me make sense of the older entries in the ledgers. Cattle prices from the 1980s, notes about drought years, even a small section devoted to Roy's failed attempt at raising bees. Cyrus laughed so hard retelling that story that Hank had to bring him a glass of water. I found myself looking forward to those visits more than I expected, filling in gaps in Roy's life that I would never have understood on my own, one story at a time, until the quiet old rancher from the family reunions of my childhood finally felt like a whole person rather than a distant relative in a handful of photographs. I also began spending time with Priya whenever she returned to double-check her readings, and she taught me the basics of reading soil composition charts over coffee at the farmhouse table. It became a small ritual of its own, her explaining porosity and permeability while I nodded along, slowly understanding just how much luck and science had aligned beneath Roy's Wells overlooked pasture. She told me once that in 15 years of survey work, she had seen dozens of promising sites turn out to be nothing, and only a handful ever amounted to what we'd found at Cedar Hollow. "You should feel lucky," she said, "but you should also feel proud. You didn't sit on this news. You brought the right people together fast, and that's rarer than the oil itself." By the time the first well was operational, nearly a year after Priya's initial survey, the ranch had transformed in ways I never imagined. The oil revenue allowed me to hire a small team to properly restore the grazing land Roy had let rest in his final years, bringing in a rotational cattle operation managed by a young rancher named Desmond Cole, who had grown up in Cedar Hollow and dreamed of running his own herd, but never had the capital to start. I offered him a partnership on fair terms, and within months, the pastures were dotted with cattle again for the first time in over a decade. Desmond had spent years working for other ranchers around the county, saving what he could and studying rotational grazing methods on weekends at the local extension office, hoping that someday he'd have land of his own to put the knowledge into practice. When I first mentioned the idea of a partnership, he was quiet for a long moment before asking if I was certain, as though he needed to hear it twice before he could let himself believe it. We spent an entire afternoon walking the fence lines together, marking out paddocks on an old survey map, and by the time the sun went down, he had already sketched a rough 5-year plan on the back of an envelope for building the herd sustainably, rather than rushing growth for the sake of quick returns. That kind of patience, I realized, was exactly the quality Roy would have respected most. Within the first season, Desmond's herd had grown from a modest starter group to nearly 80 head, all managed with the kind of careful attention that kept the grass healthy and the cattle thriving. He hired 2 seasonal hands from town, both young men who had grown up dreaming of ranch work, but had never found a foothold in an industry increasingly dominated by large operations. Watching young people find real, sustainable careers on land that had sat empty for years became one of the quiet joys of that first year. A reminder that Roy's ranch was becoming something bigger than either of us had originally imagined. The community fund the HOA and I had established began paying dividends almost immediately. The county road was repaved, wider and sturdier than before, easing travel not just for oil trucks, but for every family living along that stretch. Scholarships went out to 3 graduating seniors from Cedar Hollow High School that spring, including Dorothy's granddaughter, who dreamed of studying geology. Inspired, she told me, with a shy laugh, by watching Priya and Walter work the northern pasture that first fall. Renata Ochoa, the HOA's legal advisor, later told me that the fund's structure had become something of a model for 2 neighboring counties, considering similar agreements between private landowners and their community associations. She was invited to speak at a regional planning conference about how Cedar Hollow had managed to turn what could have been a contentious dispute over land use into a genuine, lasting partnership that benefited everyone involved. I sat in the audience during her presentation, listening to her describe the negotiations, the road funding formula, and the scholarship program, and felt an unexpected swell of pride at hearing our small town's story told to strangers as an example worth following. The scholarship recipients themselves became something of a fixture at town events after that first spring. Dorothy's granddaughter, whose name was Willa, spent the following summer shadowing Priya on smaller survey projects around the county, learning to read equipment and interpret data the way Priya once patiently explained it to me, over coffee. By the time she left for college that fall, she had already decided on a double major in geology and environmental science, telling anyone who would listen that she wanted to help other small towns find the very same kind of careful, community-minded opportunity that Cedar Hollow had found beneath Roy's northern pasture. The community center renovation became something of a town-wide project. Neighbors volunteered weekends to help paint and landscape, and Otis Bellwether, ever proud of Cedar Hollow's cooperative spirit, organized a celebration dinner once the work was finished. Long tables were set up under soft glow string lights, and half the town turned out with homemade dishes. Dorothy made her famous peach cobbler again. Hank brought his old fiddle and played until well past midnight. I stood on the porch of the newly renovated center that evening, watching neighbors laugh and dance, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel when I first arrived in Cedar Hollow with a single duffel bag and a stack of confusing estate papers. I felt like I belonged. Roy's farmhouse itself became something of a local landmark. I restored the wraparound porch, repainted the window frames a soft cream color, and hung a small hand-lettered plaque near the front door, honoring his decades of quiet stewardship of the land. Visitors sometimes stopped by just to see where the discovery had happened, and I found myself, much to my own surprise, enjoying the role of local historian, sharing Roy's stories and ledgers with anyone curious enough to ask, from school children on the to retired ranchers eager to compare notes about the county's history. Looking back on that first anxious HOA meeting, I realize now how much I misjudged the situation. I had expected a fight over control, expected suspicion and gatekeeping. What I found instead was a community structure built not to hold people back, but to make sure that good fortune, when it arrived, could be shared wisely and sustainably. The HOA didn't come for the ranch to take it from me. They came to make sure it could be developed in a way that lifted the whole town rather than isolating one lucky landowner behind a fence. Desmond's cattle operation has since grown into one of the most respected small herds in the county, supplying a farm-to-table restaurant 2 towns over that specifically advertises Cedar Hollow beef on its menu, a detail Desmond mentions with quiet pride every time he stops by the farmhouse for coffee. Priya, whose sharp eye first noticed the unusual soil readings, now runs her own consulting firm with several employees of her own and returns every autumn to check on the wells and catch up over coffee on the porch. Walter's team completed the extraction project ahead of schedule and under budget, largely because of how smoothly the community partnership allowed permits and approvals to move through the county offices. As for me, I never went back to dental hygiene, though I don't regret those years one bit. They taught me patience and precision that served me well when negotiating contracts and reviewing engineering reports I never expected to understand. I split my time now between the ranch and occasional trips back to Denver to visit old friends and former co-workers, though Cedar Hollow has become home in every way that matters. Last month, the HOA board asked me to join the land use committee myself, a request that would have seemed completely unthinkable the day I first sat nervously in that conference room. I said yes without hesitation. There's something deeply satisfying about sitting on the other side of that table now, helping other families navigate their own unexpected discoveries with the same fairness and warmth Otis, Dorothy, and Renata once extended to me. My first case on the committee involved a young couple named Marcus and Elena Vance, who had just inherited a small orchard 2 miles down the road and discovered an underground spring with enough flow to support a modest bottling operation. Watching their nervousness in that same conference room, the same wide-eyed uncertainty I remembered from my own first meeting, I found myself doing exactly what Otis had done for me, leaning forward, smiling, and telling them that this was good news, and that the whole town intended to help them make the most of it. Their relief was immediate and visible, and by the end of the meeting, we had already sketched the outline of a similar community fund arrangement, one that would help pave their access lane and set aside scholarship money for local students interested in agricultural science. Roy never got to see what became of his quiet, forgotten ranch, but I like to think he would have approved. He spent his life tending land that most people overlooked, trusting that its value would reveal itself in time. He was right, though not in the way any of us could have predicted. The oil beneath the northern pasture turned out to be only part of the inheritance. The rest was a town full of people willing to build something lasting together, and a sense of purpose I hadn't known I was missing until I found it, quite by accident, on a ranch I almost didn't bother to visit. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I pull out Roy's old ledgers and add a new entry of my own, the way he once tracked cattle prices and rainfall, though mine tend to note things like scholarship recipients, new well approvals, or the names of new calves born each spring. It feels like a small way of keeping the conversation between us going. A continuation of a story he started decades before I ever knew it existed. One page at a time, out on that porch, beneath the same wide sky, with the whole town he loved carrying it forward alongside me. These days, when new residents move into Cedar Hollow and ask about the HOA, I tell them the truth. It isn't perfect, and meetings can run long over surprisingly minor Disputes about fence colors or festival scheduling, the kind of small-town squabbles that Dorothy still finds endlessly amusing. But when it counts, when a family faces something bigger than themselves, this community shows up with resources, patience, and genuine goodwill. That's a kind of wealth no oil well could ever match. And it's the real inheritance I carry forward every single day. I wake up on Roy's old porch, watching the windmill turn slowly against a wide Texas sky.